Everyone. And this meeting is being recorded. So it's great to see everyone today. I want to thank you all for taking the time out of your day to join us. I hope you can all sit back and relax and enjoy your lunch as I speak for the next 30 minutes. And then we will have time at the end for Q&A. So today I will be talking about the American artist Irene Rice Pereira. Pereira was an abstract artist who was especially known for her paintings on layered glass. And this photo that you can see on the screen was taken in 1938 when she was 36 years old. And I want to start by showing you this work from the museum collection that we'll be using as a jumping off point for our discussion today. It's called Oblique Illusion, and it was made in 1946, and it consists of oil on glass and gesso on panel. It's currently installed in our Art and Focus gallery on the lower level of the museum, which showcases artwork from our permanent collection. And since it is on glass, this piece engages with light in a different way than if it were on canvas or paper. Because of this, it's a bit difficult to appreciate from a still photograph, as it looks completely flat here to us. Now, if this is your first time attending a Masterpieces at Midday conversation, you should know that under normal circumstances, if the museum were open, we would all be standing together in front of this artwork. And I would be encouraging you all to look at it closely and from different angles. So to that end, I'd like to invite you to engage in a quick activity of close looking as I play a video to simulate us moving around the piece. And as you watch the video, Kat is going to put a question in the chat, prompt you with a question to help prompt your looking. So I'm going to give you a full 60 seconds. I won't be talking, just giving you the space to look. And I want you to set aside all distractions, put your phone down, put your lunch down for a second. And just for this 1 minute, allow yourself to look. Okay, so the poll has ended. It looks like the question was, how many layers do you think are in this piece? And 27% of you said 3, 45% of you said 5, 18% of you said 8, and 9% of you said 12. So let's go to the next screen. So I will get to the correct answer in a second, but as you can see, the glass layers allow Pereira to embed light within her work. And in the video, I emphasize this by holding up a light source to shine raking light on the piece. So you can see how the layers create a sense of spatial depth. Pereira is an artist who experimented with materials and textures, and this piece contains 3 layers in total. The layer closest to us is beveled glass with oil painted shapes on top. If you remember your high school geometry class, this shape is a parallelogram. In particular, it's a rhombus. The middle layer is made of flat glass as opposed to beveled glass, with more rhombus shapes as well as black patterning. And finally, the layer furthest from us is a flat gesso panel with oil paint patterning and even more rhombus shapes. The effect naturally confuses the eye because the depth is distorted. And as your eye moves across the surface, it alternately deepens and then flattens. So before we get further into the life and work of Pereira, I want to quickly talk about how this piece came into the museum's possession. So we're going to take a quick detour, but I feel that it tells an important story. Oftentimes, a museum's collection begins with a donation by one or several wealthy art collectors or benefactors. And typically, depending on the taste and interests of that individual, it can shape the way a collection grows and evolves. It can also limit the scope of the museum's ability to tell a story. And we must always ask ourselves whose stories are not included when a museum is founded in this way. So I will give you just one example of how this played out in the case of ASU Art Museum's founding. Oblique Illusion was one of the foundational works donated by Oliver B. James, who you can see in this photo. James was an attorney and an art collector who relocated to Phoenix from New York. And between the years 1950 to 1955, he donated 146 objects to what was then known as Arizona State College. The donation mainly consisted of American, Mexican, and European art, but his real focus was American art. His goal was to represent the major art movements in American history, and the gift included paintings, prints, and sculptures by artists such as those you see here, Yasuo Kuniyoshi in the top left, Edward Hopper in the bottom right, Georgia O'Keeffe in the center, Alexander Calder in the lower left, and Diego Rivera in the upper right. So with this donation, James's goal was to put art within the reach of all the people of Arizona, regardless of social or intellectual status. Now, I would like to point out that of the 146 objects donated by James over 5 years, only 7 were made by women artists, which, if you're curious, and I was, works out to about 5% of the donation, and I rounded up. And this includes the painting by Georgia O'Keeffe, The Horse's Skull on Blue in the center. And it also includes the work by Irene Rice Pereira, but not originally, because the way this donation played out over 5 years was unique. In the first 3 years, so from 1950 to 1953, the only artwork by a woman artist that was donated by James was the O'Keeffe. So enter Paula Kloster. She was the first curator of the art collection at Arizona State College. And I love this photo of her here. James began to work with Kloster to build the collection in a more deliberate way. So you can see Kloster here touring a group of elementary school students in 1953. Through Paula Kloster's guidance, the Pereira was sought out by James here in Arizona while the work was traveling for an exhibition. When it was purchased and donated by James in 1953, it became the second work in the entire collection by a woman artist. So it just goes to show you a very small example of the importance of the diversity of who is in the room and making the decisions and how this causes ripple effects down the line. So now back to the Pereira. What first interested me about her is the very fact that I had never heard of her before seeing this painting in the collection. And that's not by accident. Pereira is often overlooked in the art historical canon, even though she played a major role in the development of modernism in America. Compared to other artists from her time, relatively little is known about her now. And this all despite the fact that she enjoyed critical success. She received recognition early on, and she was covered in Time and Life magazines, and she was exhibited widely during her lifetime at museums such as the Guggenheim and the Whitney. So this all intrigued me and made me want to learn more about her work and some of the reasons she is seemingly so unknown in the histories of the time period. So Pereira was born in Massachusetts, but grew up in New York and hung out in the bohemian Greenwich Village of the 19-teens and 20s, which I don't know about you, but this photo makes me cringe because they're sitting way too close together by today's standards. She also went by I. Rice Pereira to keep her gender vague, and she signed her work this way up until her death. She took night classes at the Art Students League, where she was introduced to European modernism, and in particular, Cubism and Russian constructivism. Her painting compositions from the early 30s have a geometric composition and frequent use of parallel lines and triangles. She also studied in Paris and traveled throughout Europe, and particularly Northern Africa, and wrote about the unique quality of light she experienced in the deserts of Northern Africa. But during this time, she also became fascinated by modern technology and machines. So for example, this is what her work looked like at the time. You'll see the heavy influence of machinery here. And here's another one here from 1937. And for some context, in the 1930s, society was preoccupied with the rise of technology and humanity's precarious future in a world dominated by machines. This was exemplified in movies from this time. So you'll remember Metropolis, which was the German expressionist sci-fi film about a futuristic city revolving around class struggle between people and robots. And also you might remember Modern Times from 1936, the comedy with Charlie Chaplin, in which his character is struggling to survive in an industrial society and is essentially swallowed up by this giant factory machine. So this is sort of what's happening at the time and influencing Pereira and her work. But the most transformative moment for Pereira was her association with the Design Laboratory, which was founded in 1936 and funded by the WPA. And Pereira was an original faculty member of this industrial art school that was modeled off of the German Bauhaus. It was the first institution in the US to offer a comprehensive education in modernist design. And its introductory brochure claimed that it had been, quote, created to supply a pressing need in America for people with the skills to devise, package, and promote consumer products that were styled to sell, end quote. And in this way, they would be stimulating the economic recovery after the Great Depression. So just as a reminder, a few years earlier in 1933, the Bauhaus had been forced to close down due to pressure from the Nazis. The Bauhaus, which was founded by architect Walter Gropius, had blurred the lines between fine art and craft. Its principles included an interest in true materials, minimalism, an emphasis on technology, a smart use of resources, and mainly the idea that form follows function. So while Pereira first began painting on canvas, she was involved in a unit at the Design Laboratory that tested the durability of materials. And her work from this period demonstrates her interest in modern clean lines. And she also experimented with materials such as metal, ceramics, glass, plastic, textiles, and even radioactive paint. In 1939, she made her first painting on glass, which started off as a design for a window. She certainly was not the first or only artist to work on glass, particularly during that time period. Others include Marcel Duchamp. Here you can see this piece from 1950 to 1923, The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors, which is an incredibly large sheet of glass. Joseph Albers, from the Bauhaus, was initially started as a glass designer at the Bauhaus. And Laszlo Moholy-Nagy used the new material of plexiglass, which was first introduced to the US in sheet form in 1934, for his hybrids of painting and sculpture that he called space modulators, which you can see an example of here from the Guggenheim Museum. But unlike these other examples, Pereira's glass paintings were unique attempts to show light, space, and time as what she called a physical representation of the fourth dimension. Because in addition to being an artist, Pereira was a poet and a philosopher. She was inspired by psychology and theories of perception, and her layered glass paintings became her signature artistic style as she attempted to make physical these theories investigating light, reflection, and depth. So the layers in her work may have represented the many layers of the human psyche. And the rectilinear forms, those rhombus features that we saw earlier, were a type of geometry considered by her to be the structural representation of pure thought. And here I have a quote from Pereira. "My philosophy is the reality of light and space, an ever-flowing, never-ceasing continuity, unfettered by man-made machinery, weight, and external likenesses. I use geometric symbols because they represent structural essences and contain infinite possibilities of change and dynamics." And we can see all of these things play out in our piece from ASU Art Museum's collection, Oblique Illusion. So the design laboratory eventually lost funding and the faculty dispersed to other schools, bringing their teaching philosophies with them. But at this time, Pereira enjoyed critical success. She was exhibited widely, including at the Museum of Non-Objective Painting, which is now called the Guggenheim Museum. And in 1953, she even had a retrospective at the Whitney Museum. And here are some other examples of her work on glass from that time period. You'll see that ours is dated 1946. So we'll move on to 1952. This is Shooting Stars, and this is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection in New York. This one is from 1945, and it is called Quadrangles and Two Panes, Oil on Glass and Board, and this is at the Art Institute of Chicago. Transfluent Lines from 1946, which actually is the most similar to the work we have in the collection and is from the same year, is Mixed Media on Corrugated Glass and Cardboard, and this is at the National Gallery of Art. And Light is Gold from 1951, which is glass, acrylic, lacquer, casein, and gold leaf, and is at Addison Gallery of American Art at Phillips Academy. So now we go into the 50s, and her career essentially peaked with her retrospective at the Whitney Museum. By the 1950s, she stopped, by the mid-1950s to say, she stopped working on glass and returned to painting on flat canvas. And this is actually another piece that we own in ASU Art Museum's collection, showing her later style that used these forms which she called Zs, which were not as popular as her glass paintings. So these little sort of squiggle lines she called Zs and would show up repeatedly as a pattern in her paintings from the 1950s on. And in her remaining years, she fell out of critical favor. After World War II, she was essentially eclipsed by the new abstract expressionist art movement, whose art looked very different from hers. Hers was formal and intellectual and didn't fit in with the bad boys of abstract expressionism and their more emotional style. And this may have contributed to one of the factors that made her sort of fall into obscurity. Another reason she may be so widely unknown today may be because Pereira never identified herself with a single group. She was very careful not to do that, and she preferred to mix with an eclectic variety of artistic circles rather than an established group. Another reason why her work has been difficult to comprehend to a general art audience is because it is grounded in theory. And Pereira wrote philosophical texts that became increasingly complex over time. And these are a couple examples of the texts that she wrote. For example, just for a couple of examples, she embraced cosmology, dream imagery, medieval alchemy, mysticism, symbolism, spiritualism, and geometry. Even to those familiar with complex philosophies, her material was at times incomprehensible and sometimes even contradicted itself. So by the time of her death in 1971, she had become a marginal figure who was more or less forgotten by the art world. So at this point, I'm going to close, and I think that Pereira's work and conceptual ideas deserve further investigation so that they can be properly contextualized in art history. In particular, I think that it would be interesting to consider her within the history of artists engaging with light. For example, artists here such as Monet, Mary Corse, and Turrell. Or alternatively, to consider her among artists who embrace transcendentalism, mysticism, and spirituality. For example, Hilma af Klint on the left and Agnes Pelton on the right. Two forgotten women artists who recently enjoyed more recognition with major exhibitions. So with that, I want to thank you and open this up to the Q&A portion of the chat. And I want to thank you all for being here, and feel free to ask any questions you have or any comments that you'd like to share with the group. And I'm also happy to go back to any slides anyone would like to take a look at.
We have a question. Did she always live and work in New York?
For most of her life, she did live and work in New York. For a time, she went to London after she had started to fall in favor, but she didn't like the weather there. And she ended up actually moving to Spain, which is where she died in 1971.
And then Bobby asked, did she always work in formal attire?
This is a great question, because every photo I saw of her, she was just dressed to the nines. And I think that just was part of her personality. And, you know, she wasn't an intellectual. She was very formal and proper. And this is just another way that you can see her personality in direct opposition to the abstract expressionist artists and why she may have clashed with them.
And then Pamela says, Phoenix Art Museum has one of her works, something like 6 squares, even though there aren't 6 squares there. But it also includes a lot of what looks like Chinese or Japanese writing. Do you know of her connections to that?
That's a really great question. I have not come across any connections between Pereira and Chinese or Japanese writing, but it's something that I'll definitely look into after this. Thank you for that question.
And then Estrella asked, did she ever meet or hang out with Agnes Pelton?
I was curious about that too. I didn't find any record of that, but I also want to mention that the definitive text on Irene Rice Pereira is this book by Karen, let me get the pronunciation of her name right, Karen Bearer, Irene Rice Pereira, Her Paintings and Philosophy. So I've read most of this book and didn't see any mention of Agnes Pelton, but I certainly can take another look because I find a lot of similarities between the two artists and their philosophies.
Thanks, Brittany. I had a question. I think that Irene Rice Pereira is really fascinating. I also didn't know her at first, but I have a robust knowledge of the light and space movement artists that came to the fore in the West Coast, like James Turrell and Albers and so many others that you had mentioned. But I also see, in a lot of ways, the light and space movement being male-dominated. And it really excites me that Irene Rice Pereira was theorizing light and space and even used it like verbatim, like in the 40s. Do you know if there's a lot of scholarship right now in the field that is revising this light and space movement from feminist perspective or from feminist critique?
That's an excellent question, Matt. And I think that there is starting to be a little bit of that. And in particular, the artist Mary Corse, who is another California-based artist, has enjoyed recent success with having a retrospective exhibition at the Whitney recently. But she's another artist who I also admit I hadn't heard of until her major exhibitions recently, that she embedded materials in her work that made the paintings actually sort of emit light. Some of the materials she would use were actually the paint that's used to paint highway lines, that is reflective paint. And she also used sort of radioactive materials as well. So that also made me think of Pereira's use of radioactive paint. So I think there are a lot of parallels between those two artists. And I think the fact that she herself, Mary Corse, has enjoyed a little bit more attention recently is indication that critics are starting to go back with a feminist lens to look again at some of these light and space artists that were heavily dominated by male artists. And there is also a unique relationship with California, as you mentioned, and Pereira being an East Coast artist, I don't know what her connection with to California was. I didn't really find any evidence of the fact that she had gone to California. I think a lot of her inspiration came from her time in Northern Africa. But yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And I really hope that there continues to be more critical attention paid to the light and space movement through a feminist lens.
And Anne Ludwig asked, did she ever go beyond the 3 layers of glass?
Was included up to 5 layers that I found, but for the most part, I think they were mainly 3. I did see one piece that was up to 5, but I think she experimented with that.
We have time for 2 more questions if anyone has any other questions for Brittany.
I also had another question. So I like how you contextualize Pereira within this industrial consciousness that was happening in the early 20th century in America. And I associate that kind of industrial abstraction with people like Demuth and Charles Sheeler.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if Pereira was also interested in or had any kind of interactions or affiliations with that school, that sort of, I forgot, precisionist artists?
Yes. The short answer is yes. She's often put into the same group, in particular with Sheeler. That's a great point, with the precisionists. But I think that she went beyond that group, going into a little bit more of the philosophy, and she became much more interested in light and space. So there was a brief time in the beginning when she was engaging with, machinery and industrial technology and all of that as her subject matter, but she quickly moved beyond that. And so that's why she is mentioned in the beginning in association with those artists, but not with her more mature work.
And then I had a question about the later work. It was sort of the more blue monochromatic work that was in our permanent collection. I'm always interested when artists go from abstraction to figuration after the abstract expressionist movement or during. And I'm wondering, I see like in this image, there's a little bit of figuration happening, or maybe some collage, or I'm not sure what's going on with these little panels of really dense detail. Is there any information about what's going on there?
Yeah, it's funny, I should have included more examples, because once you look up her work from the 50s on, it is just like this repeated over and over and over again. There's like no content other than this design. And so while it may look representational, it may look like a human figure, she called them Z's. She particularly called them Z's. And she really never really went back to figuration or any kind of representational work. So this kind of stayed with her until she died. But I really think it's great that we have in our collection an example of one of her glass paintings and this one from later on, just to be able to show the progression of her her style.
And then we have a question from Dina. And Dina, if you could clarify in the chat or on video, she asked, could you spell that word? And if you could just maybe give us some more information about which word. And while Dina's working on that, if anyone else has any other questions, please feel free to either unmute yourself or add them to the chat.
Oh, the lines that she used in her lady paintings, she called them Z's, like the letter Z. So the form is sort of Z-shaped, like this.
I have a question. Was her interest in spirituality and mysticism more Western or Eastern or combination of things?
A combination. And I think that, I mean, I was absolutely floored by the sheer number of philosophies that she was interested in and ascribed to over time. And, you know, I've read multiple places that they often contradicted each other. And so it's really difficult for me to understand if she held all of these competing philosophies somehow simultaneously, or if she moved from one to another fluidly. So I think it definitely deserves further attention, but it definitely included Eastern and Western philosophies.
All right, if there are no other questions, I just again want to thank everyone for being here. This has been a great series. We've learned a lot. Thank you, Brittany, so much for your time and expertise. Our next Masterpiece at Midday will be this Thursday at noon with Andrea Feller, who is also on this call. We hope to see you all there. Yeah, be well, stay well, and thank you everybody for being here.
Thank you.